The subject of the present day presentation is whether the history of language must be explained in terms of stage theory, in terms of stages we have learned in the ontogenetic development of children. In the 19th and early 20th century, it was widespread to apply the knowledge psychology had discovered pertaining to the development of language in the child to the history of languages generally. But even in later times, and even in the past 50 years, it was not out of question that the application of the knowledge of the children's language to history can be useful when one wants to understand the history of language. At first, I show you my publications about the subject. The book of Daniel Everett, Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes, will be important in the current presentation. Here are my publications. The first article is a very long article published at the platform Chaos, Historical Evolution of Culture, Mind and Language, because the book of Everett is very useful to start the comparison between the history of languages and the ontogenetic development of language. And it is also a general essay and analysis of the culture and mind of Piaget. The second article deals with the development of generic names and abstractive words in the history of languages. It is a widespread observation pertaining to primitive languages that they lack generic names and abstract nouns, and that they are full of concrete terms only. And this is a phenomenon that one can also discover in the study of the child's language. And therefore, this article approves and evidences exactly this old observation. And here are two main articles I've written about the evolution of language explained in terms of child or developmental psychology, mostly basing on the data given by Daniel Everett. I strictly recommend these two articles. In the past 50 years, or in the past 60, 70 years, the older theories of development in linguistics were replaced by theories that rebuffed, rebuked, and denied theories of development. It is especially Noam Chomsky, whose universal grammar theory replaced these older approaches. And from Noam Chomsky onwards, the idea disseminated in linguistics that there was no development from lower to higher stages in language history. That all languages unfold and exhibit the same logical structures and the same patterns of reasoning, and that the differences between languages are not traceable to stages of development. So it was a combination of universalism and cultural relativism that dominated the study of languages. Universalism, as one assumed that all languages exhibit the same amount and power of logic and reason. Relativism, because one thought that the differences, the widespread differences between languages have no connection to stages of mind. But the book of Daniel Everett threatened the theory of Chomsky and other theories close to the main ideas of Chomsky. Because Daniel Everett showed that there is a language spoken by the Pirahã in Brazil that differs from most other languages a lot, and that unfolds a lot of strange structures that question the correctness of the idea that all languages have the same logical underlying structures. But Daniel Everett did not think about the possibility that child or developmental psychology could explain the patterns he described in the Pirahã language. But I wanted to show that child or developmental psychology has the possibility and the capacity to explain exactly the patterns of the Pirahã language. And that therefore the child or developmental psychology must be the fundamental theory in linguistics to explain the history of languages in the history of humankind. That is what I wanted to show in today's presentation. First of all, I show some theories psychologists and language historians have worked out to describe the development of language in the child. Wood's stage theory discriminates 6 stages in the development of the child's language. The first stage, the stage of basic relations, knows only 2 words, mother, love. And this is a connection of 2 words, whereby the words are not modified according to conjugations or something like this, or to declinations. The second stage knows already main sentences, but it only knows main sentences and does not know subordinate clauses or relative clauses or something like that. The third stage knows already the use of questions and negative phrases. And these are the 2 stages, the stage B and C, as I will show later on, that match completely to the simple languages of the Pirahã type. The higher stages unfolding in the child aged 4 or 5 is already of a superior stage according to the comparison between ontogeny and history. The stage of advanced sentence modalities, emergence of subordinate clauses and indirect questions. The dentist that I know best is my uncle. You will not find such a sentence in the pariah language because this sentence already includes a subordinate clause, a relative clause. And the pariah language does not know this type of sentences. The fifth stage knows the discrimination of singular and plural. It appears with 5 years of age. And at that age, the modern child in modern society knows the most part of full grammar language, knows already the difficult structures of grammar. The simple languages will never attain. And the full grammar unfolds in the child after its fifth year, developing in the 6, 7, or 8 years of life. And so when we want to study the primitive languages, we must address the first stages of the child's grammar unfolding in the 3rd and 4th year. The same result is made by Jackendorf and Wittenberg, and these two authors already maintain that primitive languages, such as the Piraha or Rio-Indonesian, matches to stages of modern children during the 3rd year. And therefore, they come close to that what I want to present today. The one-word grammar, where the child only knows one word. The two-word grammar, what was the first stage in Wood's stage theory. The concatenation grammar, that is the grammar of the Piraha. And the simple phrase grammar without embedding of one phrase into another. The recursive phrase grammar, the full grammar stages are not attained by primitive languages, while the primitive languages mostly match to the stages C and D according to Jackendorf and Wittenberg's theory. And here's a stage theory of Clara and William Stern. The second stage, unfolding in the midst of the 2nd year and ending before the end of the 2nd year, matches to languages of the Pariah stage type. The 3rd stage commences with 2 and finishes with the 30th month and knows already conjugations, declinations, flexions, and co-imperatives. And therefore, the 3rd stage is superior to the level the Pariah type ever attains. The subordinate clauses arise in the 4th stage. Embedding and recursion appears at that stage, and coordination of main clauses with subordinate clauses replaces now the paratactical addition of main sentences. That means that the child before the 5th year attains most structures belonging to full grammar. And therefore, when we want to understand the primitive languages, we must go to the early language development in the child. That means that the development of simple grammar to full grammar develops in the child between his 2nd year and his 6th year. That means the development of primitive to full grammar is a development taking place during the preoperational stage, during the development of the preschool child. And that explains a lot. It explains why it was so difficult to understand language history in terms of child psychology. Because the differences in primitive languages between very simple grammar languages and complicated grammar languages falls into the reach of the pre-operational stage. Because nature peoples often speak languages that are different from the type of Piraha or Rio-Indonesian. These are languages with flexions, with several tenses, with a lot of complicated grammar structures and so on. But when we think that the modern child aged 5 has this complicated grammar structure, then it is clear that nature peoples or pre-modern archaic peoples that stay on more developed stages within the pre-operational stage, that is, have developmental ages of children aged 5 or 6, then we can understand that these peoples are able to have developed more complex grammar structures matching to stages of children aged 5 or 6. Only those nature peoples or archaic peoples that stay on the early stages of the pre-operational stage can have grammar structures so simple as we find in the Piraha type. And that means that we must refer to mental stages of children aged 3 and 4 at the maximum when we want to understand the early history of language in humankind's history. And now we should start with Daniel Everett's study of the Piraha language, because I'm sure that this language shows all those patterns of language we can provide in Stone Age languages spoken 5,000, 10,000 years ago. And according to research following the study of Everett, it was found that there are still spoken many languages in the world that are more or less close to the Piraha language. And that is, for example, the Indonesian language. Rio-Indonesian is a province language, but it resembles also spoken to other Indonesian dialects spoken in Indonesia in the oral tradition. There are two kinds of Indonesian language. The oral spoken language spoken by the populace, and the written language that has developed according to English grammar. It has adapted to a written form of language used in bureaucracy and administration and for official opinions or for official ambitions. But the Piraya language and also Rio-Indonesian is describable by the following patterns. It has no recursion and no embedding. It knows only main sentences. And it consists of a paratactical rowing of main sentences. It has no plural, no passive, only the present tense. It has no intensional verbs, and it has no strict word order, if any at all, and many other traits typical for the child's language of the second and third year of life. The Pira has no reported speech. They cannot say, "He said I'm drinking." They cannot say, "Hey, Dan, bring the nails that Pierre bought yesterday." Instead, they must say, "Pierre, bring some nails. Pierre bought these nails yesterday." They cannot say, "The man who caught the fish is in the house." They must say, "The man is in the house. The man caught the fish. He's the same." They cannot say, that drinking or that a drunken driver will be punished by prison. They must say instead, "You drink, you drive, you go to jail." Instead of being able to say, "When drinking," for a drunken driver arrested by police, imprisonment will ensue. And Rio-Indonesian has also no syntax, no word order, no inflection, no subordinate clause, no plural, and that means Rio-Indonesian has similar patterns as the Piraya language. And a lot of authors following the study of Everett came to the conclusion that traces of this simplest form of language ever discovered are disseminated and spread in the world languages spoken by third world cultures around the world. The grammar of Rio-Indonesian is reduced to the lowest minimum. The whole language resembles to the two-word order we found in the stage theories I presented previously. The whole language, Rio-Indonesian, can be reduced to the two-word order of chicken eat. That means we cannot discriminate whether it is meant that the chicken eats something or whether somebody eats the chicken. You only can deduce the meaning of the word by thinking about the context where the words are used. And that is the simplest form of grammar known. They cannot say, Piraya and Rio Indonesian, I remember to close the door. They must say, I remembered it, I closed the door. And they have no intensional verbs. They cannot say, I think the world is bad. They can only say the world is bad. Because to say, I think the world is bad provides a discrimination between subject and object, provides that there is a subject that thinks about the world. But the early child can only speak directly about the world, but not about his thinking about the world. And therefore, the child initially cannot say, I think the world is bad. And the same phenomenon we find in Rio Indonesian or in the Piraya language. The Piraya cannot say, I believe it is true. He can also only say it is true or it is wrong. And what they also cannot say, like the child very young, is that they use two adjectives in one phrase or two nouns in one phrase. They cannot say the dog is dark and tall, or the animals are dark and big. They can only apply one adjective into a phrase. And they can also not take two nouns in one phrase. They cannot say Bob or Bill will come. They must say Bob will come, Bill will come. That is the way they use. They also have now conjunctions and disjunctions like although or nor or neither. They don't have such conjunctions and disjunctions as the early child. The early child starts the application of conjunctions with and, as it is found in very primitive languages. And the child starts to use although or nonetheless with 9 years of age. And you won't find such disjunctions in primitive languages at all. So, what has Piraya and Indonesian language together with the early language of the child? I summarize. They have no word order in sentences. They have no discrimination between singular and plural. The first plural forms appear in the child with 33 months, roughly. And the primitive languages don't have plural. Tenses, and that the application of tenses is the most important one. The modern child established past tense with 30 months, roughly. Future with 36 months, roughly. With 5 years, the modern child already knows all forms of tenses, including conditional to, future to, and past perfect. Of course, mostly only passively, but it knows at least all tenses according to that what I found in linguistic theory and in the books pertaining to the subject. I only refer here that what linguistics and linguistic theory has found out that the full grammar is given in the child aged 5. It is clear that there will be some time in the development of the child to apply actively these tenses, and also in the right manner. But the researchers maintain that the modern child aged 5, knows all these tenses. But the child aged 20 months or 25 months only knows the present tense. And that is what we find in most archaic languages of the world. The Piraeus only knows present tense. And Daniel Everett explained this phenomenon by saying that the Piraeus live under the principle of immediate presence. And that this pattern, immediate presence, dominates and rules the whole consciousness and mind of the Piraeus. They don't think about tomorrow and future, and they don't think much about past. They are absorbed by the presence. They live in the presence and they think in present tense, therefore. That is what Daniel Everett found out as a general trait of Piraeus mind, language, and culture. And he is completely right in doing so, but he has no theory to explain why this is so. And therefore, I worked out that we have to refer to child or developmental psychology to explain this pattern. Because when the child leaves the sensorimotor stage, he leaves the stage where his consciousness was completely absorbed by perception and by the presence. Because the sensorimotor child, the child of the sensorimotor stage, is a child that does not think properly, that can only refer to that what it hears and what it sees. The sensorimotor child is absorbed by perception, by that what he sees and hears. But he is unable to think in a true sense. He is unable to think about future and about past. And when the child attains a preoperational stage, it has not surmounted much of this first stage. And therefore, the child aged 20 months or 30 months is still characterized by the role of presence and by the role of perceptions. His ideas and theories, no, not theories, his ideas and his reasoning refers mostly on perceptions and does not discriminate much of perceptions. And therefore, the child is shaped by eidetic system of perception and representation. That means his receptions and his perceptions are shaped by reasoning, and his reasoning is shaped by perceptions. That is typical for the eidetic stage for the eidetic way of perception and reasoning. Therefore, it is absolutely clear that the primitive languages, which only have the present tense as the only tense form, must be close to this early stage within the preoperational stage. The lack of other tenses in primitive languages evidences clearly that these languages are primitive languages formed and shaped and made by the early stages within the preoperational stage. We have not to know much more than this trait to evidence the primitive character of primitive languages. But the lack of other tenses than the present tense is widespread in primitive languages, known from ethnography, known from research made under archaic peoples of the Third World during the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. This was a usual common, that they only have the present tense. And this is also being reported from the European languages as they existed 1,500 years ago, before they adapted to the Roman grammar, to the Latin grammar. It is said from English 1,500 years ago, from the German languages 1,500 years ago, from the French and the Spanish, Italian languages spoken in their early stages, that they had only the present tense, and that only with the adaptation to the Latin grammar, they gained the other tense forms. And that is very interesting. I will come back to this trait later on. And modern children understand passive with 5 years of age only, before they only know the active forms. But that is what we also find in primitive languages from the Pariah type, that they only know the active forms. The early child, between 1 and 2 years, does not use inflections. And only during the beginning of the 3rd year, the child starts to apply inflections. And that is also given in the Pariah language, that has only a few inflections, while the Rio-Indonesian has no inflections at all. But what we know from other primitive languages is that they have inflections. A great deal of primitive languages have inflections, often in an abundant way, more than modern languages have. But Rio-Indonesian not, and Pariah only a few. What we also see, that primitive languages have no quantifiers, no comparative, and no superlative. The Pariah language has no comparative and has no superlative, as does the Indonesian language. And the superlative is more complicated than the comparative, because it bases on a comparison of all elements of a class. Then children, the young child prefers a concrete verb and does not know the abstract word. And that is a phenomenon to find in primitive languages too. We also find that the child applies a lot of repetitions. And when you look the speeches Everett documented in his book about the pariah, you also find this trait. A lot of repetitions. Repetitions, repetitions, repetitions. And the next primitive trait to find both in the child and in archaic languages is the application of onomatopoeisis. Especially during their second and third year of life, children apply onomatopoeisis. Children refer to the physical sounds objects and animals really make to form the words. They say to the cat, meow, to the dog, wow, wow, to the chicken, kikeriki, to the clock, tick tock, and so on. This phenomenon is called onomatopoeisis, the imitation of the sound the object or animal really makes to name the object or animal. And this phenomenon disappears in the child with about 4 or 5 years. Then the children regard this behavior as childish and reject it. But this typical phenomenon of children's language in the second or third year of life is to find in the primitive languages all over the world. They are full of onomatopoetic words. And the next phenomenon to find both in the language of the child and in the language of primitive peoples are the reduplications. Mama, Papa, Wow Wow, Mille Mille for milk. And that is typical for the language of a child very young. The European languages of today have only 2 or 3 reduplications per 1,000 words. But the Tupi language in Brazil manifests 66 reduplications per 1,000 words. The Tonga language in Polynesia, 166 per 1,000 words. The Maori language, 169 reduplications per 1,000 words, and so on. So we see the primitive languages are full of the reduplications of syllables, as we find in the child very young. So we can assume that the history of languages is made by psychological stages we find in the child during its preoperational stage. Whenever a primitive language is spoken, resembling to the pariah grammar, then we must provide that these people is close to the mental stage of a child aged 2 or 3 or 4 years at the maximum. And that whenever a people attains higher stages, for example, in the preoperational stage, then it will surmount these primitive traits of language. And we know from historians of language that we can investigate this history in the Mediterranean. For example, the Sumerian or Mesopotamian languages only knew in their beginnings the present tense and the main clause, not knowing subordinate clauses. And the cuneiforms, in the cuneiform writing, we can discover these stages unfolding. The Akkadian cuneiform, in their first 500 years, only knew the main sentence, and then subordinate clauses came into being after 500 years of usage. And we know from the Greek grammar that they overtook the developed forms of Mesopotamian languages when they developed in history. The Greeks overtook their grammar from the Akkadians, and the Latin language only knew a simple grammar at the time of Tarquinius Superbus, and even in centuries later on. Only at the time, the 2nd century before Christ, the Latin grammar started to develop the full grammar status due to adaptation to the Greek grammar. And then we see the next step. As European languages developed in adaptation to Latin grammar standards. And the Latin language was the main language in Europe spoken during the medieval times. And the primitive European languages overtook the traits of Latin grammar during the medieval times. And therefore, historians of language speak that the European languages 1,500 years ago only knew the present tense. But then they overtook all those tenses that Latin grammar had already developed. And the next step is when third world peoples, the native peoples, the nature peoples, and the archaic peoples of the third world overtook the grammar of the European languages, for example, from English and Spanish. And this is something you can observe when you compare Rio-Indonesian with the written Indonesian language, because the written Indonesian language resembles a full grammar language in consequence of adaptation of European languages. The same is being reported, for example, from Quechua, from Peru. It is discriminated in the oral and in the written form, and the written form has adapted more developed grammar standards, while the ancient Quechua form resembles more to primitive levels. So we see that the process of adaptation the Europeans went through in the past 2 millennia, the third world languages also went during the past 200 years in reaction to westernization and adaptation to European languages. And therefore I come to the conclusion that there is a strict parallel between ontogenetic development of language and historical development of language. I come here to a summary. Modern children and Piraia both are shaped by the Hic and Nunc consciousness. Children below 30 months of year have no number understanding as a Piraia do not have. Children below 4 years cannot draw straight lines as a Piraia couldn't in the 1980s as Everett research among them. Not educable on first class primary school level. Piraia were during the time when Everett researched among them. Now we know that Piraia children are educable, but the adult Piraia Everett visited weren't. Both have now categorical color terms like yellow, brown, red, and green. They have now quantifiers. Both have realistic dream understandings. Both believe in ghosts. No strict word order in phrases. Telegram style of sentences. Main sentences only without recursion and embedding. No subordinate clauses of any kind. Disjunctions and conjunctions are missing. No two nouns in one phrase. Not more than one adjective added to a noun. Not more than one verb in a phrase. No passive. No plural. No comparative and superlative. Most tenses are missing. Many repetitions. Preference of concrete to abstract words. Syllable duplication. Onomatopoeisis.